My name is Eliza, and for 12 years, the literary world knew me only as a shadow. Today, they know my name, but not for the reasons my ex-husband ever would have wanted. This book right here in my hands, this academic monograph with its simple cream-colored cover and my name, Dr. Eliza Hayes, printed in stark black letters, is the reason his glittering reputation is now a pile of smoking ash. It's called Uncaging the Sparrow, and it did more than just set a historical record straight. It set me free. The irony is, the man who prided himself on crafting the most intricate, compelling narratives never saw the ending I was writing for us. He thought I was just a footnote in his life story. He never imagined I would become the author of his downfall. Before I tell you how a forgotten 19th century diary, a single, dismissive sentence at an award ceremony, and 12 years of quiet resentment culminated in the biggest literary scandal in a generation, I'd love to know where you're all watching from. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated, like your voice was being silenced, go ahead and hit that like button, because this is a story for you, for all of us. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is a place where we believe that the quietest voices often have the most powerful things to say. It all started, as these things so often do, with love, or what I believed was love. I met Julian Thorne during my final year of graduate school. I was studying library sciences with a specialization in archival and special collections, a field most people found fascinating for about 5 minutes before their eyes glazed over. But not Julian. He was already a rising star in the university's creative writing program, a man who seemed to move with his own gravitational pull. He had this intense, burning curiosity, and when he turned it on you, it felt like being the only person in the world. We met in the hushed, dusty aisles of the university's rare book room, the place that had always been my sanctuary. I was examining a 17th century manuscript, and he came up behind me, his voice a low, captivated whisper. What a find. Most people just see old paper. You see the soul inside, don't you? I was, of course, completely and utterly sunk. He was drawn to my knowledge, to the quiet world of facts and artifacts I inhabited. To him, it was exotic. To me, his world was dazzling. He introduced me to his family, the Thornes, a name that carried the weight of a dynasty in the literary world. His father, Alastair, was a celebrated poet, a man whose official portrait hung in the National Gallery. His mother, Beatrice, was a fearsome literary critic for a major newspaper, a woman whose reviews could make or break a career with a single, perfectly crafted, poison-tipped sentence. And his sister, Genevieve, was a shark of a literary agent, already representing some of the biggest names in fiction. They were a closed circle, an ecosystem of self-congratulation and intellectual snobbery. And I, Eliza Hayes, the quiet librarian in training from a middle-class suburban family, was an anomaly. From the very beginning, I was not a person to them. I was a curiosity, a tool. Their sprawling home in the countryside, filled with first editions and inherited art, was the stage for their casual cruelties. I remember our first Christmas together, just a few months after Julian and I had become serious. I'd spent weeks searching for the perfect gifts. For Alastair, a rare monograph on the meter of his favorite Roman poet. For Beatrice, a signed copy of a debut novel she had championed. For Genevieve, a vintage fountain pen. I thought I had been so clever, so thoughtful. I watched as they opened them with polite, distant smiles. Beatrice held up the book and said, loud enough for the other guests to hear, "How practical, dear. You certainly know how to catalog things." The words hung in the air, a perfect little icicle of condescension. Julian squeezed my hand under the table, whispering, "Don't mind her. It's just her way. She's impressed, really." I believed him. I wanted so desperately to believe him. I mistook his explanations for protection. Later that evening, Alastair cornered me by the fireplace. He had a glass of brandy in one hand and a look of benevolent patronage on his face. "Julian tells me you have a photographic memory for dates and sources, Eliza," he said, his voice booming. "Settle a bet for us. What year was the third folio of Shakespeare published, and what was the key difference in the printing from the second?" I stood there, feeling like a parlor trick, and gave him the answer. He clapped his hand on my shoulder. Brilliant. You see, Julian? A walking, talking encyclopedia. So useful. He then turned his back on me and walked away. The topic of Eliza Hayes now exhausted. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. Useful. That was the word. Not brilliant, not charming, not kind. Useful. Like a good dictionary or a well-organized filing cabinet. Genevieve just watched from across the room. A small, pitying smile on her face that was somehow worse than the outright dismissal of her parents. Julian found me later, hiding in the library, trying to blink back tears. He wrapped his arms around me, his chin resting on the top of my head. I know they're a lot, he murmured. They're literary dinosaurs, stuck in their ways. But you, Eliza, you're my secret weapon. You're the one who actually knows things. They just posture. And I let him soothe me. I let him reframe their insults as compliments, their snobbery as intellectual rigor. I thought his love was a shield, but it was just the velvet lining of the box they were putting me in. I was so in love, so desperate for a place in his glittering world, that I accepted the role they gave me. The mousy but useful tool. My best friend, Clara, saw it from the start. Clara and I had been roommates in college, and she had a knack for cutting through nonsense that I, a romantic, sorely lacked. After that first Christmas, I told her about the evening, trying to spin it as a funny anecdote about eccentric in-laws. She wasn't laughing. She looked at me over her coffee cup, her eyes narrowed. Liza, they're not eccentric, they're rude. And he's not protecting you, he's managing you. There's a difference. I got defensive. You don't know them, Clara. Their world is different. It's not about feelings, it's about intellect. And you have plenty of that, she shot back. So why are they treating you like a search engine with feelings they can ignore? Why aren't you Eliza, the brilliant archival student? Why are you just Julian's useful girlfriend? I didn't have an answer, so I changed the subject. It was easier than confronting the truth that was already taking root in my heart. We married a year later, in a lavish ceremony orchestrated entirely by Beatrice. It felt less like a wedding and more like a literary event, a merger of the Thorne dynasty with a new, wholly owned subsidiary me. My own family felt like bewildered onlookers, intimidated by the casual display of wealth and intellectual arrogance. My father, a high school history teacher, tried to strike up a conversation with Alistair about a shared interest in the Civil War, only to be politely but firmly shut down. My dear man, Alistair had said with a wave of his hand, I deal in the poetry of war, the great universal themes. The specific dates of battles are best left to, well, to others. My father, a man I adored and respected, looked so small in that moment. I felt a surge of protective anger, but Julian was already there, steering me away, whispering, Dad's just being a snob. Darling, don't worry about it. And again, I let it go. Once we were married, the dynamic solidified. My burgeoning career at a prestigious city library was treated as a quaint hobby. Julian was working on his second novel, and the request started small. Darling, you're so good at this. Could you just quickly look up the typical diet of a Victorian factory worker? Sweetheart, I'm stuck on a detail. Could you pop over to the archives on your lunch break and find me a map of 1880s London? The request grew, becoming demands disguised by affection. My lunch breaks became his research hours. My evenings, once spent on my own academic pursuits, were consumed by his footnotes. He was building his career on the foundation of my own, and he made it feel like a privilege. We're a team, he'd say, kissing my forehead as I handed him a stack of neatly organized notes. I'm the architect, you're the master builder. We can't do it without each other. There was a conference in Boston I had been dreaming of attending. I had submitted a paper on the preservation of delicate medieval documents, and it had been accepted. It was the first major professional recognition I had ever received, a chance to be seen as a scholar in my own right, not just an appendage to Julian Thorne. I was ecstatic. I booked my flight, my hotel, and spent weeks perfecting my presentation. 3 days before I was due to leave, Julian came into my study, his face a mask of panic. He was on a tight deadline for an article, a companion piece to his new novel, and he claimed to have hit a major wall. "Eliza, I'm ruined," he said, running his hands through his perfectly tousled hair. "There's a specific historical figure, a minor one, that the entire argument hinges on. I need everything on him. Letters, public records, anything. I need it by Friday." "Julian, my conference is tomorrow," I said, my stomach tightening. "I can't. I have to go." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a carefully calibrated desperation. "But darling, this is for a major international magazine. This is the launch pad for the new book. This is for us. Your paper, you can present it another time, can't you? This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for our future." He framed it as a choice between my small, personal ambition and our grand, shared destiny. He made my dream feel selfish. I looked at my printed plane ticket sitting on my desk, the pages of my speech neatly clipped beside it. And then I looked at him, the brilliant, celebrated man who was, he claimed, completely dependent on me. I felt a wave of resignation wash over me, the familiar feeling of my own needs shrinking in the face of his. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll cancel my flight." He was effusively grateful, kissing me and calling me his savior. I spent the next 2 days in a frantic haze, buried in the archives, working tirelessly to pull together the information he needed. I emailed the conference organizers with a lie about a family emergency. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as I did it. I found what he needed, of course. I always did. He met his deadline. The article was a success, and he was praised for his astonishingly deep research and command of obscure historical details. He bought me a beautiful, expensive bracelet to thank me. "To my partner in crime," the inscription read. As it clasped shut on my wrist, it felt less like a gift and more like a beautiful, golden manacle. Clara was furious when I told her. "He didn't need you, Eliza. He needed a research assistant, and he was too cheap to hire one. He made you sacrifice your own career for his convenience." This time, I didn't argue. I just stared at the bracelet on my wrist and felt the cold weight of its truth. Life went on like this for years. Book after book, Julian's star rose higher and higher, and my world became smaller and smaller. I was the silent, uncredited partner in his success. The family's attitude towards me settled into a kind of permanent, patronizing affection. I was dear, reliable Eliza, the one who could always be counted on to find the missing puzzle piece for Julian's genius. I had become so enmeshed in his life, so convinced of the team narrative, that I had almost forgotten I ever had dreams of my own. My work at the library became my only refuge, the one place where my skills were valued for what they were, not for how they could serve Julian. My colleagues respected me. I was Dr. Hayes, the expert on 19th century ephemera. It was only when I went home that I became just Eliza, the fetcher of books. Then came the great writer's block. Julian was contracted to write his magnum opus, the book that would cement his legacy. And he was completely, utterly stalled. For months, our apartment was a tense, miserable place. He would pace his study for hours, emerging only to be irritable and morose. The charm was gone, replaced by a raw, frustrated ego. He was short-tempered with me, dismissive of my attempts to help. "You don't understand the pressure, Eliza," he would snap. "This isn't about just finding facts. It's about finding a soul, a story. And I have nothing." He was unbearable. And as always, it fell to me to manage his moods, to soothe his ego, to find a solution. My own life was on permanent hold, waiting for his inspiration to strike. It was during this fallow period that I found her. I was at the university archive, my true home, working on a project that was actually mine. The university had received a large, unsorted donation from a crumbling country estate, a jumble of boxes that had been sitting in an attic for a century. It was my job to sift through it, to see if there was anything worth saving. Most of it was junk, old account books, dry legal documents, pressed flowers that crumbled to dust at a touch. But then, at the bottom of a heavy wooden trunk, tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed linens, I found it. It was a small, unassuming volume, bound in worn green leather. It had a simple brass clasp, tarnished with age. There was no name on the cover, but when I carefully opened it, the first page had a title, written in a delicate, determined cursive, a sparrow's ledger. And beneath it a name, Isabella Vance, 1868. The moment I started to read, the world around me fell away. This was not the typical diary of a Victorian lady, filled with notes about social calls and embroidery patterns. This was the work of a blazing, brilliant mind. Isabella Vance was a self-taught naturalist, a poet, an artist, and a philosopher, all trapped within the confines of her domestic life. She wrote with a scientist's precision about the nesting habits of wrens, the intricate patterns on a beetle's wing, the life cycle of a fern. Her drawings were exquisite, detailed, and alive, but woven in with the scientific observations was a passionate, fiercely intelligent inner life. She railed against the gilded cage of her existence, the societal expectations that dismissed her intellect. She wrote of her yearning for education, for travel, for the freedom to be recognized for her mind, not just her marriageability. Her voice was so raw, so modern, so full of longing and wit and rage, that it felt like she was speaking directly to me across the century that separated us. I felt a profound, almost painful kinship with this forgotten woman. I had stumbled upon a treasure, not just a historical document, but a lost soul. I almost kept her for myself. A part of me knew with a chilling certainty what would happen if I showed her to Julian. But the bigger part of me, the part that was still the dutiful wife, the team player, believed that this could be the thing that saved him, that saved us. I drove home in a daze, clutching the diary to my chest, as if it were a living thing. I found Julian in his study, staring blankly at a bare page. "Julian," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "I found something. I found someone. You have to read this. Her name is Isabella Vance, and she is magnificent." I laid the diary on his desk like a holy relic. "This, I thought, will change everything." And it did, just not in the way I had ever imagined. Julian's initial reaction was exactly what I had feared. He picked up the diary, his expression one of bored skepticism. He flipped through a few pages, his gaze skimming over her beautiful cursive. "A lady's diary, Eliza," he said, a patronizing smirk on his lips. "What am I supposed to do with this? Write a charming little piece about pressed flowers?" His condescension was a familiar sting. "Just read it, Julian," I insisted, my voice tight. "Don't look at what she was. Look at who she was. Listen to her voice." He sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound, but he agreed. He took the diary into his study and closed the door. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of nervous anticipation. A few hours later, he emerged. His eyes had a strange light in them, an intensity one hadn't seen in months. It was a look I knew all too well, the look of a predator who has just spotted his prey. "She's interesting," he conceded, his voice carefully neutral. "Her descriptions of the natural world are quite vivid, almost professional." That was the moment. He didn't see the woman, he saw the material. He didn't see her soul, he saw a quarry to be mined. Over the next few days, he began to question me, but his questions were unervingly specific. He wasn't interested in Isabella's frustrations, her intellectual passions, or her emotional depth. He wanted to know about the type of ink she used, the social customs of her small village, the names of the flowers she described. He was systematically stripping her life for parts, like a vulture picking a carcass clean. And I, in my blindness, helped him. I was so thrilled that his block was broken, so desperate to be a part of his creative process again, that I threw myself into the work. I spent weeks in the archives, cross-referencing Isabella's entries with local histories, botanical guides, and meteorological records of the period. I was essentially writing the nonfiction blueprint for his fiction. I built a file for him that was hundreds of pages long, a complete portrait of Isabella Vance's world. I'd bring him my findings, my eyes shining with excitement. "Look, Julian, I found a record of the frost she wrote about in December 1869. It was one of the worst in a decade. That's why the sparrows were so desperate for food." He would nod, absorb the information, and say, "Excellent work, darling. This is wonderful texture." Texture. That's all her life was to him. That's all my work was. Just texture for his great art. As the months went on, he grew more and more secretive. His study door, which had been open during the research phase, was now permanently closed. When I'd ask how the book was going, he would be evasive. It's a delicate process, Eliza. I can't talk about it. It would break the spell. The collaborative we of the early days had vanished completely. It was now his book, his process, his spell. A cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I had a terrible feeling that I had not given him a gift, but had instead handed a beautiful, rare bird to a man who only knew how to put things in cages. I tried to talk to him about it one night, gently. I hope you're doing her justice, Julian, I said. Isabella's voice is so strong. I hope it comes through. He patted my hand without looking up from his notes. Don't you worry, darling, he said. The book is going to be magnificent. People will be captivated. He didn't say they would be captivated by her. 2 years later, The Gilded Cage was published. The title itself was a slap in the face, a phrase stolen directly from her diary. The book was an instant, monumental success. The critics, led by a gushing, completely biased review from his own mother, Beatrice, hailed it as a work of staggering genius. It was the story of a tormented male artist in the 19th century, a man of profound sensitivity and intellect, who finds his muse in a fragile, beautiful, and ultimately tragic young woman named Arabella. This fictional muse, Arabella, lives in the countryside, where she makes exquisitely detailed observations of the natural world, which she shares with the male artist, sparking his genius. He had done the unthinkable. He had not only stolen Isabella Vance's words, her observations, her very soul. He had given them to his male protagonist. He had made her the brilliant one. And Isabella, renamed and stripped of her intellect, was reduced to a pretty, decorative vessel. A beautiful, simple-minded muse whose only purpose was to inspire a great man and then conveniently die. I read the book in a single, horrified sitting. With every page, the cold knot in my stomach tightened. He had plagiarized her spirit. He had erased her. He had performed the most profound act of literary theft I could possibly imagine, and the world was celebrating him for it. I felt a nausea, so deep it was physical. This wasn't just a betrayal of me and my work. It was a desecration of Isabella's memory. The woman who had raged against her own gilded cage had been posthumously locked in another, even smaller one, by my own husband. The book was nominated for every major award, culminating in the big one, the international prize that was essentially the Nobel for English language fiction. I moved through the award season in a fog of complicit silence. What could I say? He was my husband. I was Eliza Thorne. To speak out would be to detonate my own life. I smiled for the cameras, wore the elegant dresses Beatrice picked out for me, and stood by his side, feeling like a ghost at the feast. His family was ecstatic. They treated me with a new kind of warmth, the warmth one reserves for a lucky charm that has finally paid off. You see, dear Eliza, Beatrice said, squeezing my arm at a pre-award gala. We knew you'd be good for him. Every great man needs a quiet, stable place to rest. You've been the perfect anchor. An anchor, something heavy and inanimate that keeps a magnificent ship from drifting. The night of the ceremony was surreal. It was held in a grand, historic hall filled with the most famous writers, critics, and publishers in the world. When they announced his name as the winner, the room erupted. Julian, a master of feigned humility, looked appropriately shocked. He kissed me, a dry, public peck on the cheek, before striding to the stage. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs, a strange, cold clarity beginning to dawn. He gave a brilliant speech, of course. He was always a magnificent performer. He thanked his father for teaching him the music of language, his mother for sharpening his intellect, his sister for her tireless advocacy. And then he came to the end. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. The cameras zoomed in on my face, projecting my image onto the giant screens on either side of the stage. And finally, he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity, I must thank my dear wife, Eliza. A hush fell over the room. This was it. The moment where he could, if he chose, tell the truth. Where he could give me, and by extension Isabella, a sliver of the credit we were due. My breath caught in my throat. I thank her, he continued, a small, charming smile playing on his lips, for tirelessly fetching the dusty old books that sparked my ideas. He paused for the applause. It was polite but warm. The perfect, loving husband acknowledging his supportive, background wife. I could feel Beatrice's smug gaze on me from the front row. I saw Genevieve give me a little, condescending nod of approval. And on the giant screen, I saw my own face, a carefully blank mask. But inside, something shattered. Fetching the dusty old books, he had reduced my intellectual labor, my discovery, my months of passionate research, my very soul's connection to Isabella, to the work of a servant, a delivery girl, the spark, not the fire, not the roaring blaze that he had stolen, just a tiny, insignificant spark. In that moment, watching him bathed in the golden light of the stage, I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel sad. I felt a sudden, liberating wave of pure, cold, incandescent rage. The car ride back to our hotel was a study in contrasts. Julian was electric, practically vibrating with triumphant energy, clutching the heavy gold medal in his hand. He was talking animatedly, replaying the night, dissecting who had said what to him, who had looked jealous, who had been genuinely impressed. I sat beside him in the plush leather seat, utterly silent, staring out the window at the glittering, indifferent city. The expensive dress I was wearing felt like a costume. The diamonds on loan from a jeweler felt like ice against my skin. I said nothing. My silence was a dense, heavy object in the small space of the car. He didn't seem to notice for the first 10 minutes. So absorbed was he in his own glory. Finally, he turned to me, his euphoria momentarily dimming. "Are you all right, darling? You're very quiet. Are you overwhelmed?" "No, Julian," I said, my voice flat and unfamiliar even to my own ears. "I'm not overwhelmed." He frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Well, what is it then? This is the greatest night of my life, of our lives. Can't you at least try to be happy?" We pulled up to the hotel. The doorman opened my door, but I didn't move. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, without the filter of love or hope. I saw a handsome, charming, celebrated man. And I saw a thief. "We did it, Eliza," he said, giving my knee a little shake, trying to jolly me out of my mood. "Can you believe it? We did it." That was the word that finally broke the dam. We. I got out of the car and walked through the lobby, my heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. He followed me, still chattering, oblivious. When we got inside our suite, he poured 2 glasses of champagne, holding one out to me. I ignored it. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest. "We," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury I hadn't known I possessed. We did it? Is that what you think?" He stopped, the champagne flute halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about?" "Your speech, Julian," I said, the words coming out hard and sharp. "You thanked me for fetching books, like a dog." "Fetch, Eliza, fetch." His face hardened. The charming, public mask fell away, revealing the cold arrogance beneath. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Eliza, don't be so dramatic. It's an acknowledgement, not a bibliography. You're being overly sensitive." "Sensitive?" I laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You stood on that stage and took credit for a life's work that wasn't yours. You stole a woman's soul, Julian. You took Isabella Vance, a genius, and you turned her into a simpering, tragic muse to prop up your own ego. And me, you turned me into the maid who dusted her off for you. That's not being sensitive, that's being erased." He actually scoffed, setting the champagne down with a sharp clink. "This is absurd. It's called fiction, Eliza. It's the creative process. I took a spark, as I so generously said, and I built a universe from it. It's something you simply wouldn't understand. You're a librarian. You catalog things that already exist. I create them. You file away the past. I build the future." There it was, the truth of how he saw me, the truth of how he had seen me all along. A cataloger, a filer, a creature of the dusty, irrelevant past. Not a creator, not an intellect, not his partner. His functionary. In that moment, 12 years of swallowing insults, of minimizing my own needs, of accepting the role of the useful mouse, came to an end. The rage had burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute calm. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice even. "I do deal with things that already exist. Things like the truth." I walked into the bedroom, pulled my suitcase from the wardrobe, and began to pack. He watched me bewildered. "What are you doing?" "Stop being hysterical." "I'm not being hysterical," I said, folding a sweater with steady hands. "I'm being logical. I am a librarian after all." "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "You're just tired and emotional. We'll talk about this in the morning." "No," I said, zipping the suitcase shut. "We won't." I walked past him toward the door of the suite. He grabbed my arm. "Eliza, stop this. Where are you going to go?" His face was a mixture of anger and genuine confusion. The thought that I could, or would, actually leave him had simply never occurred to him. He had believed his own fiction. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. "You said it yourself, Julian," I said, pulling my arm free. "You're the creator. So create yourself a new research assistant." And I walked out of the suite, out of the hotel, and out of his life without looking back. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't be Eliza Thorne for one more second. I took a taxi to the airport and bought a ticket for the first flight back home. I landed in the early morning, a ghost of a person in a crumpled evening gown, and went straight to the one place I knew I would be safe, Clara's apartment. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, my suitcase in hand, mascara smudged under my eyes, she didn't even look surprised. She just opened her arms, pulled me into a hug, and said, "It's about damn time." For the first week, I just slept. I was exhausted on a cellular level, worn down by years of being someone else. Julian called, of course, dozens of times. He left messages that swung wildly from furious, "How dare you humiliate me like this?" to pleading, "Darling, please come home. I miss you. We can fix this," to condescending, "I know you're not thinking clearly. Just come back and we can forget this ever happened." I deleted them all without listening to the end. His sister, Genevieve, sent a text. "Eliza, this stunt is unprofessional and is causing Julian immense distress. Whatever your issue is, you need to handle it privately and with dignity." I blocked her number. On the 8th day, I woke up and the fog had lifted. It was replaced by a single, burning purpose. I sat down at Clara's kitchen table with a laptop and a cup of coffee and began to type. I resigned from my job at the city library. Then I drafted an email to the head of the history department at my old university, a man who had been my mentor in grad school. And finally, I began to write a book proposal. The title came to me in a flash of inspiration, Uncaging the Sparrow. Isabella Vance and the Erasure of Female Genius in 19th Century Naturalism. I wasn't just going to tell Isabella's story. I was going to use her story to tell a much larger one, about the systematic appropriation of women's intellectual labor by the men in their lives. It was going to be my story, too. My old mentor responded within an hour, offering his full support. He put me in touch with an editor at the university press, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma. The name sounded formidable, and I was terrified. I was just a librarian, a runaway wife. Who was I to write a groundbreaking academic work? But the memory of Julian's words, "You catalog things, I create them," was a spur. Fine, I thought. I'll catalog the hell out of your lies. I went to the meeting with Dr. Sharma, feeling like an imposter. I was wearing a borrowed blazer from Clara, and my hands were shaking. Dr. Sharma was a sharp, elegant woman in her late 50s with intelligent, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. I laid out my proposal, my voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as I began to talk about Isabella. I spoke of her wit, her genius, her rage, her beautiful, stolen voice. I explained how her work had been lifted, distorted, and used as a foundation for a celebrated novel. I didn't even have to mention Julian by name. She knew. The literary world was small. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. She looked at my proposal, then back at me. "The sourcing is impeccable," she said, her voice crisp. "The argument is explosive." She leaned forward, a fierce light in her eyes. This isn't just a book, is it? This is a reckoning. I just nodded, unable to speak. Good, she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. Those are the best kinds of books. She slid a contract across the table toward me. The press will give you a generous advance. We want you to have the resources and the time to do this right. No distractions. She looked at me pointedly. You are Dr. Eliza Hayes, a brilliant archival scholar. You are the world's foremost expert on Isabella Vance. We are honored to publish you. She called me Dr. Hayes, not Eliza, not Mrs. Thorne. The name felt like armor. I signed the contract, my hand perfectly steady. The next year was the hardest and most fulfilling of my life. I moved into a small apartment near the university and poured everything I had into the book. I practically lived in the archives, meticulously transcribing every word of Isabella's diary, annotating it with thousands of hours of research. I tracked down her letters, her family records, even a distant relative who had a portrait of her. I was not just writing a book, I was resurrecting a person. Every fact I uncovered, every connection I made, was a brick in the wall of truth I was building. It was grueling, lonely work, fueled by cheap coffee and righteous anger. There were days I was crippled by self-doubt, hearing Julian's voice in my head, telling me I was just a cataloger. But then I would read a passage from Isabella's diary, her voice so clear and defiant, and I would feel my own resolve harden. I was doing it for her. And in doing so, I was finally doing something for myself. The day Uncaging the Sparrow was published, I felt a strange sense of calm. The work was done. The truth was out there. Dr. Sharma and her team had orchestrated a masterful launch. They hadn't positioned it as a quiet academic text. They had sent advance copies to a handful of influential journalists and critics, specifically to prominent female critics who existed far outside the Thorne family sphere of influence. The first review appeared in a major online literary journal, under a headline that made my breath catch, The Sparrow Song. Did a literary giant steal his prize-winning novel from a forgotten woman? The article was devastating. It laid out my research in clear, undeniable terms, showing side-by-side comparisons of Isabella's diary entries and passages from The Gilded Cage. It didn't just suggest plagiarism, it proved it. Within 48 hours, the story had exploded. It was everywhere. It was a perfect storm, a tale of literary theft, hidden history, and a powerful man brought low. Hashtag Uncage the Sparrow started trending on social media. Feminist scholars, historians, and book lovers rallied around the cause. My book, an academic monograph, sold out on Amazon. The literary world was in an absolute uproar, calling it the biggest, most shocking scandal in decades. The phone in my small apartment began ringing and didn't stop. The BBC, the New York Times, The Guardian, everyone wanted an interview. The confrontation I had been dreading and on some level anticipating came 3 days after the first review dropped. There was a frantic, angry pounding on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and my blood ran cold. It was Julian, and he wasn't alone. His mother, father, and sister were standing behind him, a phalanx of righteous fury. For a second, the old, conditioned fear gripped me. I wanted to hide, to pretend I wasn't home. Then I thought of Isabella. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. Julian looked like he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and panic. Eliza, how could you, he spat, trying to push his way inside. I didn't move. I stood my ground in the doorway. This is insane. You've ruined me. You've ruined our family. His mother, Beatrice, shoved past him, her face a mask of pure venom. You bitter, ungrateful little mouse, she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. We took you in. We gave you a life you could only have dreamed of, and this is how you repay us. By trying to tear down a great man out of pure, pathetic jealousy. Alistair stood behind them, his face a stony mask of disappointment. I am profoundly disappointed in you, Eliza. This is a betrayal of the highest order. And Genevieve, ever the agent, stepped forward, her voice sharp and pragmatic. You need to stop this, Eliza. Retract the book. Issue a statement. We can still contain this if you cooperate. There are careers at stake. I looked at their four faces, a gallery of privilege and outrage. They weren't there to apologize, to understand, or to reckon with the truth. They were there to silence me, to put the mouse back in its hole. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline calm. I looked at Beatrice. A mouse, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the silent hallway. You may be right, but you forgot one thing about mice. They are quiet. They watch. They get into the foundations of the house. And they can chew through the wires until the whole thing burns down. I then turned my gaze to Julian, who was staring at me as if I were a stranger. I didn't ruin you, Julian, I said, the words clear and final. I simply published the truth. Your ruin is your own creation. You did this to yourself, and you did it to Isabella Vance. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the mess you made. I stepped back into my apartment. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an interview with the BBC in 20 minutes. And I closed the door and their four stunned, furious faces turned the deadbolt and leaned against it, a slow smile spreading across my face. The mouse had roared. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The fallout for the Thorne family was swift and brutal. The committee that had awarded Julian the prize announced they were launching a formal investigation into the ethical integrity of the source material for The Gilded Cage. His publisher, under immense public pressure, issued a weak statement about creative license before ultimately announcing that his next book contract was indefinitely suspended pending review. Genevieve's literary agency began to hemorrhage clients. Prominent authors, particularly women, released public statements saying they could no longer be represented by someone so complicit in such a flagrant act of intellectual theft. Even Alastair was not immune. A group of feminist poets organized a protest outside his next scheduled reading, holding signs that said, "Honor female voices," and "Literary theft is not poetry." The Thorne Empire, which had seemed so unassailable, was crumbling from the inside out. I agreed to a single, major television interview. I knew it was my one chance to control the narrative, to make it about what truly mattered. I sat across from a respected journalist, the bright studio lights warm on my face, and I felt no fear. She asked about Julian, about the betrayal, about my marriage. I answered politely but briefly. My personal history is not the story, I said calmly. The story is about a woman named Isabella Vance. For the next 20 minutes, I didn't talk about myself. I talked about her. I told the world about her brilliant mind, her sharp wit, her incredible resilience. I read passages from her diary, my voice filled with the admiration and love I felt for her. I wanted the world to see the woman Julian had tried to erase. I wanted them to fall in love with her, and they did. By the end of the interview, Isabella Vance was no longer a footnote. She was the hero of the story. Genevieve tried to call me a few days later. I saw her name flash on my screen, and, against my better judgment, I answered. It wasn't a call of apology. It was a business proposition, couched in threats. "Eliza," she said, her voice strained and false. "Listen, we all said things we didn't mean. Things are getting out of hand. If you would be willing to issue a joint statement with Julian, something about the collaborative nature of your work, a misunderstanding, we could put this behind us. It would be better for everyone." "Better for who, Genevieve?" I asked calmly. "It seems to be going quite well for me. And for Isabella." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Don't be naive," she snapped, her mask of civility slipping. "You can't fight us. We will sue you for libel. We will drag your name through the mud." "Go ahead," I said, a strange sense of lightness filling me. "You can't libel the truth. My book has over 500 footnotes. Every single claim is sourced. How many does Julian's have?" I hung up the phone before she could reply. A week later, a package arrived at my apartment. It was a thick, manila envelope with an unfamiliar return address. Inside was a letter, written in the shaky hand of an elderly woman. "Dear Dr. Hayes," it began. "My name is Eleanor Vance. Isabella Vance was my great-great-aunt." My heart stopped. The letter went on to explain that she was the last of her family line and had grown up hearing fragmented stories about her brilliant, eccentric Aunt Isabella, who had died young. She had never known the details, only that her aunt had been a scribbler. She had seen my interview on the television and had wept. "You have given my family its history back," she wrote. "You have given my aunt her voice." I called her immediately. We spoke for over an hour, two strangers connected by a woman who had been dead for over a century. Eleanor cried, I cried. She told me she had a trunk in her attic, filled with more of Isabella's things, including family photographs and more letters. She wanted me to have them. This new material was a gift, another layer of truth to add to the historical record, a final, beautiful vindication. The next year, my life transformed in ways I could never have imagined. Uncaging the Sparrow won 3 major nonfiction awards. It was being translated into a dozen languages. And most thrillingly, it was optioned for a feature documentary by a renowned female director. I was hired not just as the lead historical consultant, but as an executive producer. I was being given the power to shape and protect Isabella's story on a global stage. The irony was not lost on me. Julian, the great artist, the creator of fictions, was now professionally silenced, while I, the humble cataloger, was a producer helping to create a new narrative for millions to see. I was no longer just turning on the lights. I was building a whole new house on a foundation of truth. 2 years after the book was published, my life was unrecognizable. I had accepted a position as a visiting fellow at a prestigious university on the East Coast. My work was focused on what I now called narrative justice, the act of uncovering and restoring the stories of marginalized figures, particularly women, who had been erased from history. With a portion of the royalties from my book, I established the Sparrow Foundation, a small grant-giving organization that funded the research of other scholars doing similar work. I was no longer Eliza Thorne, the novelist's mousy wife. I was Dr. Eliza Hayes, the historian, the advocate. I had a purpose that was entirely my own. I saw Julian one last time. It was at a large academic conference. I was there to deliver a keynote address. He was just there, an attendee. No one was fawning over him. No one was rushing to shake his hand. He looked smaller, older, diminished. His prize had been formally rescinded a year earlier, a historic, humiliating moment. His books were still in print, but forever tainted by the scandal. He was a ghost of his former self. He saw me across the crowded hall and his face went pale. He made his way toward me, pushing through the crowd of students and professors who were waiting to speak with me. "Eliza," he said, his voice husky, almost a whisper. "Can I have a word?" I excused myself from the group and stepped aside with him. Up close, I could see the desperation in his eyes. "Eliza, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words sounded hollow, rehearsed. I was under so much pressure. I didn't know. I wasn't thinking. But I always loved you, you know, in my own way. I looked at him, at this man I had once loved with every fiber of my being, the man whose approval I had craved like oxygen. And I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even the ghost of love. It was like looking at a stranger, or a character in a book I had read a long, long time ago. His apology wasn't for me, and it certainly wasn't for Isabella. It was for him. A last, pathetic attempt to rewrite his own story, to make himself feel better. "Thank you for that, Julian," I said, my voice polite and distant. "I have to get back to my colleagues now." I gave him a small, final nod, turned my back on him and walked away. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his validation. I didn't need anything from him at all. I was already free. Looking back, I realized I didn't set out to get revenge. I set out to find justice for a woman whose voice I refused to let die. But in fighting for Isabella, I inadvertently fought for myself. For 12 years, I had let my husband and his family define me, confine me, and write my story for me. They cast me as a minor character, a useful tool in the grand narrative of their own success. The greatest discovery I ever made wasn't Isabella's diary. It was the realization that I could pick up the pen and write a different ending. The Gilded Cage was never really hers. It had been mine all along. And finding the key wasn't about bringing him down. It was about letting myself out. My value was never tied to his recognition of it. It was there all along, waiting in the quiet archives of my own soul, waiting for me to be brave enough to read it. The most important lesson I learned is that your story is yours to write, and you should never hand the pen to someone else. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to my story. I truly believe that sharing our experiences is how we find our strength and our community. If you have a story about finding your own voice or standing up for yourself when you were underestimated, I would be honored if you shared it in the comments below. Your story could be the one that gives someone else the courage they need. And of course, if this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and empowerment. Remember, sometimes the world needs to be reminded that the most powerful roars come from the quietest places. Thank you for listening.